You're now listening to the Engage the Rockies podcast, your go-to podcast for local and state issues concerning Colorado.
Hello, Colorado. This is the Engage the Rockies podcast. I am your host, Jarvis Caldwell, Executive Director of Engage the Rockies. This week's episode, we're going to be talking about something that you may have heard of, but don't quite really have an understanding of. Throughout the years, this is something that's been going on for quite a while, and there's a lot of people on the ground, mostly volunteers, who are working really hard to try to make this happen. And what we're talking about today is Article 5 Convention of States. And so we have what I would consider an expert here to talk about this, and that is Mr. Mike Forbis. So Mr. Forbis is part of the Colorado Legislative Liaison Team for the Convention of States Action. Convention of States Action calls for an Article 5 convention to propose amendments that, quote, impose fiscal restraints on the federal government, limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government, and limit the terms of office for its officials and for members of Congress. And today we're going to kind of go over some things. What is the Convention of States? Where does that authority come from? Has it ever happened before? How many states are involved in this right now? And a few other topics. So we hope you appreciate this, and when you walk away from listening to this, that you feel much more educated on it. So, Mike, thank you so much for joining us, sir.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. So let's jump right into this here. So let's start off big picture for the audience. What is Article 5 Convention of States, and where does that authority come from?
So essentially, the overall purpose of the Article 5 Convention is to limit the power of the federal government. You listed a three-part platform in the beginning, but the overarching purpose is limiting the power of the federal government. When we talk about Article 5, we're talking about Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution. There are 7 articles, but Article 5 is one of those that a lot of people don't know what it is. It's the amendment process to the Constitution. And I thought what I would do is let me just read it to you.
Okay.
And it doesn't take long. And I'm going to use my little pocket Constitution here. So let me just read it so everybody knows what it is, and then we can talk about it.
Yeah.
Article 5. That Congress, whenever 2/3 of both houses shall deem it necessary, shall propose amendments to this Constitution, or on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the several states, shall call a convention for proposing amendments, which in either case shall be valid to all intents and purposes as part of this Constitution, when ratified by the legislatures of the 3/4 of the several states, or by constitutions in 3/4 thereof, as one or the other mode of ratification may be proposed by Congress. So that's what it is. And so you talked about authorities. Well, there's basically 2 authorities across 2 different pieces of Article 5. So the first part I want to talk about is the way to propose amendments. So there's 2 authorities to propose amendments. The first one, which most of us know about, is that Congress, by 2/3 majority vote in both chambers, can propose amendments. That's how the first 27 amendments originated, and that's how we basically know the current 27 amendments. Now, another authority to propose amendments is an Article 5 convention, or as you have said, Convention of States.
Right.
That's where 2/3 of all state legislatures propose an application for a convention to meet to address specific issues, like the 3-part platform that you just discussed. So those are 2 authorities for proposing things. Now, there's the other side of Article 5, which is the mode of ratification. Again, 2 different authorities here. Most amendments, the first 27 amendments, 26 of those were ratified by 3/4 of the state legislatures. In this case, 38 out of 50 is what it would be today. One amendment, the 21st Amendment, was ratified by state conventions. So a state level convention, not ratified by the state legislature. Right. So those are the 2 authorities to ratify amendments. So 2 parts to the Article 5 is proposing amendments and ratifying amendments. And there's 2 authorities in each of those methodologies. So that is what is the basic setup of the Article 5 that I just read to you. And
Right.
hopefully it makes sense. A lot of folks may not understand the convention, Article 5 Convention of States, where people come together to propose amendments,
Right.
because that did not happen in U.S. history.
Yeah, well, and that was actually going to be my next question, which was, has there ever been a convention of states? So, if I understand correctly, there's never actually been one, which kind of moves us in kind of the next arena here, which is how close are we to getting one through the work you guys are doing? How many states are involved in this now?
So, if I may, before I do that,
Yeah.
even though there's never been a convention, there
Mhm.
have been convention applications submitted by states. And
Okay.
I'd like to give you an example, because this is not the first time it's been attempted by states to form a convention to propose it. This is not the first time. But I want to give you an example of how it's been done in the past and what the result was. The example I want to talk about is the 17th Amendment, which is the direct election of senators. So the
Mhm.
17th Amendment was added to the U.S. Constitution in 1913. Well, from the years 1899 to about the year 1912, over the course of 13 years, 29 states had submitted an application for a convention to meet to have direct election of U.S. senators.
Right.
There was a single issue, just a single issue. By the time 29 got to 29, you needed 32 at the time, because there were 48 states in the nation.
Right.
So 32 is 2/3 of 48. So Congress, when they saw 29 applications were reaching pretty close to 32, Congress took it upon itself to go ahead and actually construct the amendment, the 17th Amendment. And it did. It passed in 2/3 in both chambers of Congress, and then it was ratified by the states. But that's an example of where conventions have been called, applications have been submitted by the states. So it's
Mhm.
not the first time it's been attempted. It's just that it never reached the benchmark to have 32 in that example. Now, what I'll also say is, if anyone has ever wondered what other issues have been submitted for applications for a convention, you can go to the article5library.org, and there's a listing of single issue convention applications that have been submitted by states over the course of time. And there's still some that are still active for single issue amendments. So,
Yeah.
so even though it has never happened, it doesn't mean that it hasn't been attempted. So
Right.
that's why I wanted to just take a moment to explain that example. So then the next question is, where are we at today?
Mm.
Okay, so you described how we have a 3-part application today. So that application for a convention is fiscal restraints on the federal government, limiting the jurisdiction of the federal government, and then term limits for members of Congress and federal officials. So that's a 3-part platform. So that's multiple issues in the current application.
Mhm.
Right now, nationwide, there are 19 states that have passed this application, starting with Georgia in the year 2014. Now, that was 10 years ago, but just in the example I showed you with the 17th Amendment, it took 13 years just to get 29 states. So
Right.
there's not a time frame for when this really has to happen. When a
Right.
state submits its application, it doesn't have a deadline to it unless they decide to rescind it.
Right.
In this case, Georgia's the oldest one, and it's sitting in the clerk of the U.S. House of Representatives on the website there, along with the other applications, waiting for enough to be added up. Now, the current number that's required today is 34 out of 50 states, so that's 2/3. So
Right.
we are 15 states short currently to meet that benchmark to actually call a convention to talk about that 3-part platform. Now,
Yeah.
what's very critical here is that every state has to have the same platform. One
Right.
state can't just say, well, I'm going to look at just a balanced budget. That doesn't count.
Yeah.
It wouldn't aggregate up to the convention. It's got to be the same application, because it's got to be counted in the same scale and scope for the convention to meet. So that's an
Yeah.
important thing to understand, is that multiple single issue applications you'll find like on Article 5 library. This is really the first application where we're looking at multiple issues. And so it makes it worthwhile, because I think with the 3-part platform doesn't mean it's one amendment per per platform. It could be 2 out of 1 platform, like physical restraints could have 2 term limits, and officials could be 3. You could have anywhere from maybe 5, 6, 7, 8 amendments that come out of this convention
Right.
and then propose for the states and then ratify.
So
So that kind of brings it up to where we are today. Hopefully
yeah,
that.
absolutely. And so just to kind of add on to that, so you made an important point there, which is this current application that you guys are working on, and that's what your organization does, is you're working with different state legislators from all around the country, and the important thing is your organization, Convention of States Action. You guys are getting those same 3 topics.
Correct.
You're trying to get those across the board, because if a different state only uses one of those 3, then it doesn't count towards what you're actually doing. And which leads me into actually kind of the next question that we can expand on a little bit here is, and I read this in the introduction, but those 3 issues that your organization focuses on is impose fiscal restraints on the federal government, limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government, and limit the terms of office for its officials and for members of Congress. So let's just touch on all 3 of those just a little bit. I think the third one that I read is probably the most obvious, term limits for office for officials in Congress. I know there's a lot of support when you look at polling. It's something like the high 80s, the high 80 percentile people support term limits on Congress. Now, I know there's a fair argument to say, well, a term limit for a congressman is the voters, right? Voting them out of office.
Right.
Now, there is a separate side of that argument, which says, well, you have the power of incumbency, which can make it extremely difficult to get voted out of office once you have that machine behind you.
Yes.
Yeah, please add or take away from that however you want.
For
But
that very specific issue about term limits for members of Congress, I always like to start with people. Let's talk about original intent. Original intent of congressmen or delegates to a continental Congress goes back to the Articles of Confederation. In the Articles of Confederation, there's 13 articles. In there, it talks about how a delegate from one of the colonies, of the original 13 colonies, are only elected 1 year at a time. And in a 6-year period, they're only allowed to serve 3 years total. That there in itself was a term limit. Not only on top of that, but what's also interesting is those delegates to the Continental Congress never received a salary. They never were paid. And so think about someone doing their duty, going to the Continental Congress only for a few years at a time. Hey, you weren't getting paid for it. It's on your own dime. So that's the first original intent that I like to share with people. It's like, this thing about term limits is nothing new. It's not. And so when you look at today, this is my own personal research I found. So in the Congressional Research Services, CRS is what it's called, is actually a branch under the Library of Congress. It is a nonpartisan research service for members of Congress, and they publish reports on various subjects. And they actually publish a report on a career tenure of members of Congress, and they date it back all the way to 1789, the first Congress. When I came across that report, I found something interesting. Since 1950, members of Congress have, on average, sought re-election, if they choose to be re-elected, range from like 88 to 97%.
Wow.
That's how many of them sought re-election.
Yeah.
Their success rate for re-election was from like 89 to 97%. So this thing about you talk about incumbency is true. And that's been the range since 1950. In my mind, career politicians started in the mid 1950s. That's about 70 plus years since that's really been the case. And so this idea of career politicians has been around for about 80 something years now, close to 80 years. And so you have to ask yourself, is it really time for a change to happen? Have we gotten away from the original intent, like from the Articles of Confederation? I would say the answer to that is yes. And so we have to put in something in place to determine, well, do we want this? Do we want career politicians? Do we want professionals to then run for Congress because they feel like they need to do something to make things better, but they're not there to keep power. Because honestly, the longer somebody serves in Congress, longer time you serve means more power. That's basically what it is. Now, what would be the appropriate number of years? Opinions could be for 12 years, 18 years, or 24 years, where a person can serve in Congress. Like it's a combination of both the House and the Senate. I've heard different arguments on it. I have my opinions on what that is. But whatever that number is really what I think the American public needs to look at. Now, I think one of the positive fallouts of that is there might be a potentially increased level of trust in Congress if you don't have people going there just to be reelected every year or every time they call for reelection. I think that might be a good thing. Might put more trust back into the government. That's an inherent fallout out of a second or third order consequence I'd like to see happen.
Yeah.
That's a very touchy subject for some politicians. I guess they don't want to admit to it, but go back to Articles of Confederation. In my mind, hey, that was the original intent. So let's embrace that. Let's just get back to that. And I think term limits will help settle a lot of things.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Most of your state legislatures, I believe, they have term limits. In Colorado, it's 8 years, which is 4 terms for the House of Representatives. For Senate, it's 8 years, which is 2 terms of 4 years. The governor, the Secretary of State, they all have 2 term limits, and I believe they're all 4 years. Even our sheriffs and whatnot, and the President of the United States is limited to 2 terms as well. So it's not necessarily unprecedented. Now I have heard counter arguments, which is then you kind of put the bureaucracy in charge because you have people in these special interest groups who are there for 25, 30 years. And so it gives them more power by limiting the legislators. But that's a debate, a conversation we could spend way too much time on. Let's
there's no universal answer to all the problems.
Exactly.
All we're really trying to do is improve our government, is improve our system of government. I can't tell you that anything that comes out of the Article 5 Convention will fix everything. It won't.
Right. Yeah.
We're just trying to make things better. And it's our system of government. It's our way. The amendment process in Article 5 is for us to use to make things better, but it'll never be perfect. So if anybody, we're going to do that, I'm sorry, I just don't have an answer for that.
Yeah, Thomas Sowell's quote is perhaps my favorite. I use it all the time, but there's no solutions. There's only trade-offs. Okay, Mike, I want to respect your time. Let's touch on real quickly the 2 other issues that you guys have laid out. So impose fiscal restraints on the federal government and then limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government. So just quickly, let's touch on impose fiscal restraints on the federal government. That's very broad, which I'm sure it's probably specifically broad, but kind of what is the idea or intentions behind that?
One of the biggest amendments that come up as a topic of discussion of fiscal restraints is a balanced budget amendment. A balanced budget, essentially, the basic definition of it is federal expenditures cannot exceed federal receipts in one fiscal year. That's really the most basic idea of what it is. Now, federal budget's a lot more complicated than that. That's true. But the amendment to the Constitution will not be complicated. It has to be something simple along those lines. Because of the national debt that we have right now, that's a concern. How do we balance the budget? Well, there's different opinions on that. I can tell you, if you look at the congressional record from 1982 to 2018, 9 specific times did a balanced budget amendment come on either the House floor or the Senate floor for full debate and vote. And it failed in all cases.
Yeah.
The closest I've seen was in like 1995, 96 when it was passed in the House when Newt Gingrich was the speaker. And then it went to the Senate where Bob Dole was the Senate majority leader. And 2 times the Senate voted on it, and it fell short by 2 votes both times. And that was the closest it ever came from the congressional record I've seen.
Right.
So I don't think Congress will get it done. There are currently 31 states that still have an active application for a balanced budget amendment for an Article 5 convention to come together. I don't think that will happen as a single issue convention. So I think we need to bring it into the Article 5 convention that we're talking about with those three-part platforms, and it needs to be discussed. I think that if you have a convention where you have people just dedicated to just that issue only, or those suite of issues only, where Congress has other business it has to attend to with other legislative priorities, it can't give its undivided attention. So I think it's a positive thing for the Article 5 convention to meet the just resolved issue that Congress couldn't get to. And it's nothing against Congress. I think there was an honest attempt by a lot of these leaders to have a balanced budget, but we were real close a couple of times there. I think the Article 5 convention will get it done what Congress could not. Now, that's the one big amendment that comes up all the time.
Yeah, well, the way I learned about Article 5 Convention of the States was those two first issues we just talked about, term limits and then balanced budget. Those are things that I think it's bipartisan support that believe in those two things. Let's touch on the third one real quick, right, which was limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government. Now, again, what comes to mind to me is the 10th Amendment, states' rights. And so what do you mean by limit the power and jurisdiction? Like, are there kind of specific potential examples?
There are a couple of terms in the Constitution right now, in Article 1 in particular, that has given Congress almost excess power. Mm-hmm. The term of commerce, the term of general welfare. Those terms are used very loosely by Congress to justify spending or regulating interstate commerce. What we mean by limiting the power of federal jurisdiction is maybe better defining those terms and what they mean. And so Congress will not be allowed to go outside those terms. Right. So those are just a couple examples. Another example I like is an abrogation. That's where you repeal a act of Congress, an executive decision, or maybe a judicial decision from the Supreme Court. So, like, for example, if you don't like a Supreme Court decision, what could happen is if you have a simple majority of all states, like 26 out of 50 states, vote to repeal the Supreme Court decision, that could be one of the amendments. And what that does is
that's very interesting.
It puts a check on power on the Supreme Court, or in some cases, the president, if he has an executive order he decides to sign, well, mm-hmm. It could be repealed by a vote of like 26 out of 50 states, an abrogation. It's repealing of a federal act like that.
I'm just trying to think through this practically. If you did get something like that, that would really change the dynamics, I think, probably in state governments, because then all of a sudden there would be a lot more money in state governmental races, because I think right now, the last I remember, I think it was 26 or 27 states are like the houses are Republican controlled, and then Democrats control the rest, whatever's left over there. So it's, and the point I'm making is that it's actually fairly close to a 50-50 split amongst all the states, if I have my numbers correct. And so if you had some kind of amendment like that you could repeal the decision of the Supreme Court through a simple majority of the states, that would be a very interesting dynamic, because then all of a sudden people would be paying more attention to state races at a national level, because you'd be trying to flip state legislatures one way or the other.
What you're describing is how power comes back to the states,
right?
Not in the federal hands. It's like another system of checks and balances between state power and federal power. And that's really what all this is about. Like I said, limiting the power of the federal government, put a check on them where, hey, don't do something you may not, the states may not like. And so you're going to be challenged on that.
That's very interesting.
Now, it's still very bureaucratic for it to happen, but that's okay.
Right.
And that's all right.
Okay, Mike, I got two last questions for you here. And one of them I accidentally missed while we were talking about how many states have actually passed this resolution. And that is, since we're a Colorado focused podcast, has Colorado passed this convention of states?
No, it has not. It has not.
Okay.
And what I'd like to say is that for the last 3 years, we have made attempts to get that resolution, same resolution, Article 5 convention, that's with the other 19 states that have passed it, the same language. It's a 2-page resolution. It's not a long document. It's 2 pages. And we tried it in 22, 23, and 24. Back in April this year, I think we've had our most successful showing to date. We had 27 members of our team, just normal citizens, just like you and me, that went in front of the committee. Representative Rose Puglisi sponsored the resolution, and we provided testimony to the committee over a 2.5-hour period. We were well organized. We had a very good showing. We educated legislators in the committee. It did not pass. It didn't. But what was successful about it was our most successful opportunity to provide education on the convention overall. And so I expect we'll have greater success next year. And this is the one thing that I always try to tell people. Even if Colorado is not one of the 34 states, we are still eligible to send commissioners to the convention.
Right.
The state legislature can nominate X number of commissioners, however many the state of Colorado wants to send, and we can send them to the convention. That's still something that can happen. And I look at it as I'm trying to educate legislatures. I'm trying to educate citizens here in Colorado on what it's about, even through this mechanism we have here today. And if people are being informed, that's my goal right now. That's my first goal. Oh, I'd love to see Colorado be one of the 34 states. I'd love to see that. It's still my desire. Still want to push that. But I also know that there are other options. I really believe it will happen. There's enough desire, I think, in the emotional outlook of this country that we want it to happen. Because, amendments help to heal the nation, help to heal division in the nation. So that is my perspective.
Very interesting. Yep. Like you said, as long as you guys keep at it and keep chipping away, then maybe it will in the future. But as you pointed out, even if Colorado isn't one of those 34 required states, if the 34 pass it, then basically Colorado, all the states are invited. So Colorado will still have a say at a convention of states.
Exactly. And even on the ratification end of it too.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Because it's 34 states to call the convention and then 38 to ratify whatever the amendments are.
Every state can go to the convention, and every state can consider amendments for ratification.
Right.
Every state.
All right. Well, this brings me to my last point. I'm a very pragmatic and practical person, and theory. In college, theory always drove me crazy because I'm trying to think of, okay, how does this actually work? And so my question to you is kind of in practical terms. Let's say we all 34 states sign off on this, and a convention of states is going to happen. Like, what does this actually kind of look like in practical terms? And is it something that's been test ran before? But are there people who know how to actually conduct this?
Yes. Yeah. So there have been 2 practical simulations of it that were done. One was in 2016. One was done last year, 2023. It was a 2 to 3 day convention simulation of how this thing would actually come together. In those first 2 simulations, state legislatures were actually invited from all 50 states to attend. On average, there was about 3 to 4 legislatures from each state that attended. In some cases, they might have been retired legislators or just people that understood the parliamentary procedures. So some folks are not sure how a convention of states work, and honestly, it's nothing more different than how state legislatures work. I like to refer people to how do you set up your state legislative procedures. Those procedures are published in every state chamber. There's 99 state chambers. Nebraska only has one. Only has a Senate, doesn't have a House.
Right.
So each one of those state chambers follows some kind of legislative procedures. And if you really look it up, if you really peel the onion back, there is published procedures that have been used throughout history. The one that's most well known is Paul Mason's procedures, or Mason's manual on legislative procedures. That's used by probably more than 70% of all the state chambers. It's a it's like a listing of best practices, historical practices over the course of 200 something years, and it's updated every 10 years, and every state can put their own input into it. Another option is using Jefferson's Manual of Legislative Procedures. That's another one. And the third one out there is Robert's Orders of Legislative Procedures. Those are the three. All the convention has to do is just pick up a manual that's used by the state legislatures and use that as a starting point. Now, when the convention comes together, it can still adjust some of its own rules, like how does it want to vote? How does it want to have the setup of the committees? I mean, every time you begin a new legislative session, like even here in Colorado, the first thing that you do is you adjust your rules or procedures, or you keep whatever. Sometimes there's adjustments for that legislative session. Congress does the same thing.
Right.
So when a convention comes together, there is nothing new that we really have to come up with on how that's going to work. It is a legislative body that comes together to examine potential amendments, propose potential amendments. It's like passing a bill or a resolution in your state legislature or city ordinance to your city council. There are procedures, and there's nothing that we really have to come up with that's brand new. We would we would start the convention, select legislative procedures, most likely Mason's manual, I would say, because the Senate in Colorado uses that, by the way. It does. Senate Rule number 40 does that. So there's nothing that we need to do different. We just set up some of the rules and look at what those rules are, maybe adjust some of them based on historical precedent, and then we initiate that in the convention. The real convention, I think, will be probably, in my opinion, 60 to 90 days. Some opinions are it would be 6 months. So those 3-day simulations that I talked about, 2016, 2023, are a much reduced version of what that will be.
Right.
But that's okay. At least something like that would put into practice. So some people are concerned about how it would operate. Well, I don't think you need to be concerned about that. You just got to look at how your state legislature operates. And you tell them, well, it's going to work like it does here in Colorado, or Louisiana or what other state, maybe with some slight modifications. But we're not going to start from ground zero with blank sheet of paper.
Yeah. I went back just kind of randomly and this week and started rewatching John Adams, which is an HBO series from I think the early 2000s. I think it's Paul Giamatti plays John Adams, and
it's a book written by David McCullough.
That's right. And so the second episode is called I think it's called Independence, and it's about the convention in Philadelphia and when Jefferson drafts the Declaration of Independence, and so to me, when I think of Convention of States, I kind of relate it back to that, which is you have your states, which then at the time it was colonies, sitting around, and you have somebody running the meeting, and then they break off for committees, and then Jefferson and Adams and Franklin, I think, were on the committee to actually draft the Declaration of Independence, and then there were other committees that handled other aspects of it. So I imagine, I think of it like that with a lot less wigs, probably.
Yeah.
But,
exactly.
Okay,
Yeah.
I kind of lied to you, Mike. I said I only had 2 questions left. I have one more question for you, and I think this is an important one, which is I've heard concerns before, and just stuff that I've read before, that a concern with Convention of the States is that let's say you get the 34 states and then you have the convention, people worry that it'll go off the rails and maybe start focusing on things that it shouldn't be focusing on. So like somebody may get the idea, hey, you know what, we should change the First Amendment while we're at it and say you have the freedom of speech except for hate speech or something, or you have a Second Amendment right but not an individual right, or something along those lines. People are just worried that it'll backfire and go off the rails. What would your organization and you say about that concern?
So this is the most historical piece of evidence that I've used to try and explain to somebody why this convention will not address individual liberties and rights. It's about limiting the power of the federal government. If you take the original 1787 Philadelphia Convention, it had commissions from 11 of the 12 states that attended. These 11 commissions said, we are sending commissioners to this convention to develop a more adequate federal government or constitution. Mm-hmm. Basically, it's saying we need to improve the Articles of Confederation. We need a better government than the Articles of Confederation. Nowhere in those 11 commissions did it talk about a Bill of Rights or individual liberties. Now, what happened during the 1787 convention, towards the end of it, when it's coming into the last 2 weeks, it was 4 months long altogether. Some delegates like George Mason and Mayor Jerry, I forget his first name, was from Massachusetts, and George Mason was from Virginia. They tried to propose that the Constitution needs to have a Bill of Rights attached to it. And the reason why George Mason was very good at developing that is because he's also the author of the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which was 1 month before the Declaration of Independence being written. In there, it had similar rights to what we find in the Bill of Rights right now. So he wanted to propose something similar during the convention. However, he was shot down, especially by George Washington, who was the president of the convention, because he clearly said, this is beyond the scope of our commission here in this convention. So that was not accepted in the convention. But later on, the Bill of Rights was introduced by the first Congress in 1789. And then it was passed by both chambers of Congress, sent to the states, and ratified in 1791. That's what we have as our first Bill of Rights. Right. So the point I'm bringing up here is, when you bring the Article 5 Convention today, it does not have a commission that even discusses liberties or rights. It's about limiting the power of the federal government. So any discussion of trying to change, like the First Amendment, the Second Amendment, Fifth Amendment, whatever, that involve individual liberties, will be beyond the convention scope and scale.
Right.
Period.
So
and
the
historical precedent from the 1787 convention supports that same idea.
So basically, a convention that has these three topics that you guys have put forward to different state legislatures, if that's what gets the 34 threshold, that's what it focuses on. But it at the same time, it doesn't delve into individual liberties or rights.
It's not a runaway convention, correct?
Right.
And that's sort of the term. It's not going to be a runaway convention. You might say the 1787 convention was a runaway. No, it wasn't. It just had a very broad scope. I mean, it was like build more adequate federal government / constitution. Right. And you look at those state commissions back then. So the state commission for the Article 5 that we talked about is fiscal restraints, term limits on members of Congress and officials, and limiting the jurisdiction of the federal government. That's it. It's that 3-part platform. Nowhere in that language is there anything about adjusting individual rights or changing liberties that we now have as a protection of the Constitution. That's not going to happen. So for that to be talked about, it's just not true. It's not going to happen. And that's why I like to use the 1787 convention example to debunk that fear. You know, it's plainly obvious that that's not going to happen.
Excellent. Well, listen, Mike, I really appreciate you taking the time to explain this. You know, at Engage the Rockies, we're all about educating Coloradans on different issues, and this is an issue that I think a lot of people will find very, very, very interesting, and just something that just frankly isn't talked about enough. But it's, like you said, it's called Article 5 for a reason, and it's because it comes from our Constitution, so it's something we should know about. So if people want to find out more, I believe I wrote it down correctly, conventionofstates.com. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, conventionofstates.com. If you go on there, I think you guys might have a map on there, and it shows states that have passed it, states where it's been proposed, among a lot of other resources there, including the actual language itself from Article 5. So, and you guys have some really helpful videos on there. I know there's one that I believe your organization made that takes clips from Lincoln and some other things to give some historical perspective.
I would tell you, if I may,
please.
This is my last talking point that I really like to share with people. I gave my own personal testimony back in April. I used the 13th Amendment as an historical reason why we need to have another convention today. So Abraham Lincoln in 1865 was advocating for the 13th Amendment be added to the Constitution because it was eradicating slavery. And we were still in the closing months of the Civil War. But when he got it finally passed through the House, and the movie Lincoln talks about that. But what the movie doesn't talk about is how it was ratified by the states. And what I want to say is at the time of the Union back then, there were 36 states. 11 of those states were in the Confederacy. So you had 25 states that were part of the Union, what have you. 36 states, 3/4 of 36 is 27. Well, 25 states in the Union was not going to be enough to pass and ratify the 13th Amendment. But when it actually went to the states for ratification, of the first 27 states that actually ratified it, 10 of those were slave states.
Interesting.
What I'm trying to get at here is that because of the high division that we faced in the Civil War as a country over the issue of slavery, 620,000 American lives were lost on the battlefield. The Civil War, in my mind, is the most historic division in this country's history.
Yeah.
And Lincoln believed that the 13th Amendment, as he called it, was a king's cure for all the evil. He believed that God was using the 13th Amendment to help heal the nation from the Civil War. And so what I like to use that historical example and fast forward to today. If you really think about the emotional division that we see in our nation today over centralized power in the federal government, I think a way to help heal the nation is through the amendment process of the Constitution. And so I think the Article 5 Convention is a way to help heal the nation. It will not fix all our problems, but I think it will help heal our nation and bring us to a much better state than where we are now. So that's my final pitch for why I think we need the Article 5 Convention, is because I think it's a mechanism that God will help use to help heal our nation. Just like you did the Civil War. At least certainly Lincoln believed.
That's a great place to leave off there, Mike. I really appreciate it. Thanks for giving us that perspective on it. And again, for the listeners, conventionofstates.com if you want to find out more. As always, please like, share, and subscribe for our podcast. Share this around to other people who you think may be interested. And again, Mike's a volunteer for Convention of States Action, and he's a volunteer because he wants to educate people on these issues. And our goal here at Engage is to not necessarily advocate for, but we want to educate people. So if you go on conventionofstates.com, maybe you agree with it, maybe you don't, but at least you'll be educated on the topic. So Mike, thanks again, sir. And I appreciate it very much. And maybe we'll talk again next legislative session and see if you got any further on it.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate the time today. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Engage the Rockies podcast, your go-to podcast for local and state issues concerning Colorado.